Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. We always appreciate it. My name is Batu Khan. I'm the communications coordinator for ACMS. ACMS is a nonprofit educational organization that works to strengthen and deepen academic and cultural connections between the United States and Mongolia. As our speaker is going to be presenting live, please mute your mics and leave your questions in the chat box. We'll try to address them during the Q&A session. By now, most of you probably know that our speaker series format is evolving into two distinct formats. We also have a monthly panel session that's coming up on the 20th of this year, or in a week. If you'd like to be informed about our future sessions, you can either subscribe to our YouTube channel or you can join our mailing list at the bit.ly/addresses. But tonight it is my pleasure to host Diane Wolff, who's the award-winning author of 3 books about Chinese history and culture. Her presentation today will be based on her book titled Batu Khan of the Golden Horde, The Mongol Khans Conquer Russia, which is the first book in her forthcoming Silk Road series about the successors of Chinggis Khan. This is the first talk about her first book of this series, and you can learn more about her works at her website, www.dianewolff.com with 2 Fs. So thank you, Diane, and over to you.
Thank you, Natso. It is such an honor to be speaking to you because I've been working on this series for 20 odd years. And I'm just going to tell you a story from the books because in this time of the healthcare emergency, I think we could all use a little entertainment. So what I do is I write for a general readership, and these books were created for young readers. And I have found that the adults read them when they're written for young readers. So, but the idea is that it's not scholarly work per se, although I base it on the best scholarship since World War II. And for that, I have to thank my mentor, Morris Rasabi, who is the biographer of Kublai Khan. But these stories are so exciting and so fabulous, and they are being considered as part of course materials for a course in global history. So when I talk to young students, the question is, why study history? And what I tell them is, this is how we got to where we are. And in particular, what I'm going to talk to you about today, which is a really, aside from the fact that Batu Khan is completely lost to the West and unknown, and in fact, he was one of the greatest rulers after Chinggis Khan. He was a grandson of Chinggis Khan, and he was the Khan of the Golden Horde. So if you want to understand the Russia of today, this is Russia's Asian past, which most people don't know about because it's not usually covered from the Russian side of the histories. So this is the view from the other side, and it's based on the best scholarship since World War II. There's been a tremendous explosion of scholarship, but the general reader doesn't know about it. So I'm going to cover on this talk what I don't cover in the book, which is about the trade, because most people who hear about the Mongol Empire think it was about war. And the study of the conquest is fabulous for what it reveals about the strategy, the way these people thought. But what I have emphasized in this book is that the Mongol Empire was as much about trade as it was about war. So I'm going to explain to you, we have a map of the Mongol Empire that we're going to show to you so that you get an idea in your mind of the extent and the location of where Batu Khan was. The center of the empire was in Mongolia, but the conquest went all the way across Asia, Central Asia, to Russia, and then down into Iran and Iraq. So it was the largest land-based empire in world history. And you can see it on this map. To the right of the screen is the China part, to the left of the screen is the Golden Horde. That's where Batu was. And he invaded Europe with an army, and they would have won, except that the great Khan died in the homeland and the armies withdrew because many of the imperial princes were riding with him and they wanted to participate in the election as ruler. And then underneath the Russian horde, the Golden Horde, that Khanate was the Central Asian Khanate, which went all the way across Central Asia through the Muslim lands, and then down, you see the Persian Khanate is today's Iran and Iraq. And the trade, mostly during this era, was by camel caravan. And it was dominated by the Muslim capitalists, the early Muslim capitalists who had a total monopoly of the banking and the finance of, this is the medieval world. And this is the world that ended with, partly because of Batu Khan, but with this conquest. What Chinggis Khan did was he built roads across this world like the Romans. And so the whole empire was connected, and he gave a code of laws which enforced the peace. He's not generally thought of as a lawgiver, but he did give a code of laws, and it was said that a virgin could walk from one end of the empire to the other with a sack of gold on her head and go unharmed, because he enforced the peace. And the reason was that he was interested in the revenues from trade. The Mongols themselves took tribute from the places they conquered. They did not engage in trade, but they let all the local people engage in the trade, and they just took the taxes and the tolls. And so when Batu conquered Russia, it's very interesting. So I'm going to tell you more about this in a second, but at that time, the part of Russia, it was Kievan Rus. Russia was centered on the Ukraine. Moscow had not yet come into importance. So what they were all trading was Europe at this time. I'm just going to give you a brief background of where the world was at this time. China was the richest and most advanced civilization on earth, and that was the main object of Mongol arms. Europe was still recovering from the fall of the Roman Empire. The markets were in disarray. Capitalism was in its infancy, and Europe was poor. So where these people were trading was all the stuff from the East. And then in the Muslim world, there was disunity. Various caliphates were fighting each other for power. In Europe, various Christian sects were fighting each other for power. The Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope were at war, and they were completely unaware of the rise of this power in the East. So the age that this ushers in is the age of seagoing trade, because in the transition from this world, the medieval world, to the modern world, the camel caravans go into use, because now we're going to show you the second map. This is the Maritime Silk Road. And it shows you that the Arab dominance of the trade, you can see in the red lines, I hope you can see it. This was a coastal trade. And marked on this map, which is on my website, you can also see this is what they were trading. You can see the spices in Indonesia and Sumatra. From China come porcelains and silks. Very hard to transport by camel caravan, which is why they were so costly. Then you can see this trade is hugging the shore, because the Arabs were not open ocean sailors, they were coastal sailors. And then on, timber, elephants, gold. But all of this, the origin of all of this was a big secret. The Arabs kept all this a secret so they could control the trade. And when Marco Polo, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about okay, let me just say this. So they get the goods over to the Straits of Hormuz. They go in through the Persian Gulf, and all of the trade goes through, or most of the trade goes through Baghdad, which is a huge center, a transshipment center. From there, it goes to the Black Sea and Constantinople and shipped to Europe. So that was the maritime trade goes overland, goes to Europe. And then the camel caravans went across the roads. So what happened when the roads opened was that the European traders were allowed to get into this trade for the first time since antiquity. And this was the rise of early European capitalism. They started making fabulous fortunes, the merchant princes. And like the Medicis, it was a rivalry between Genoa and Venice. And these fortunes financed the Renaissance. And what the Renaissance meant was the rebirth of science in Europe. And what happened when science was reborn in Europe? Of course, part of this was that Batu Khan changed the direction of Mongol conquest, and I'm going to tell you about that. And so he wanted the end of the Muslim powers in the Middle East because they were threatening the peace that was making him rich. So they violated the code of Chinggis Khan, and the man that he put on the throne gave an order that they were to be brought down, and they were brought down. And once they were brought down, the trade opened. And in Europe, it was the creation of precision instruments for navigating oceans, the creation of large ocean-going vessels, and the creation of big cannons. And it was the beginning of the age of exploration, the Western dominance of the ocean, and the entry into the modern world. And that's why this is significant. That's why I'm telling you this story. And then the final map that we have shows you, do we have the, okay, so you can visualize this. You can see the route of the Silk Roads across the land, the route of the ocean-going trade across, and then to the land, and then to Constantinople, where it was all transshipped. So, and now we can go back to, so I've explained that to you. So, Batu was a grandson of Chinggis Khan, and he was the most able leader after Chinggis Khan, he and one other leader. And what happened was, he grew up at the time, he was born in 1205. His grandfather had just consolidated the empire in 1204. So in his early youth, he had the traditional upbringing of a boy at that time. He learned how to ride, he learned how to shoot, but he saw the making of a government. He saw the making of a world empire. This was his youth. And in that camp was the great chancellor, who was the statesman of the Mongol Empire that Chinggis Khan had recruited from the fall of China. And he was creating the actual governments that ran the Khanate, which was local rule. And then the top part of it was the Khans were over that. But they used local people, local forms of taxation. They never tried to impose. And the one thing that they did was they promoted religious toleration. This was part of the law of Genghis Khan. So when Batu, so he learned all that. 13, he went into the Imperial Guards. This would have been in 1218. And there he was observed by his grandfather for all the young princes. Their skills were observed, their talents for command, and they were assigned command. As the son of the eldest son, who was supposed to be the furthest from the father, his father was to become the Khan of Russia, which was the attack wing of the empire. So Batu had to be able, he had to be counseled. And all those generals, the hallmark of the Mongol army, it was a meritocracy. They were brilliantly led. They had brilliant commanders. There was a strategist who was the chief strategist, General Subedei, and he is the one who rode with Batu. It was an imperial prince in command and then an actual general in command. And the idea was Genghis Khan established the Khanate in Central Asia. He was forced into that war by the breach of his rules, his law, which is all detailed in the book. And then they discovered that the road was open to Russia. And at that time, Russia was centered in Kiev. The Russian princes were up the Volga River in their walled cities. And at that time, they elected their princes. The Pope had sent a crusade against the Russian princes to bring them back to the Orthodox Russian Church. They considered heretics, so they wanted to bring them back to the Catholic Church, which is the famous battle that's in the Eisenstein film on Alexander Nevsky, where he led the German troops, the Teutonic Knights, out onto the River Neva, and the ice wasn't frozen, and he won the battle. So this is the great hero of Russia. And when the Mongol army burned the Church of the Virgin to the ground in Kiev with all the famous and rich inhabitants inside it, Nevsky decided to surrender his city of Novgorod, because if he didn't, they were going to torch the city. Now, I'm talking to you about the enlightened side of Mongol rule. There is a harsh side to Mongol rule. So what the Russian princes figured, they thought they would do better under the Mongols than they would do linked to Europe, because the Khans let them practice their religion. They didn't make them get rid of their religion. And the Mongols did not engage in trade. So the Russian princes Russia was rich. It had timber, it had furs. So they thought they got a better deal under the Mongols. The only problem was it lasted for 200 years. But in the meantime, Batu made his camp on the lower Volga, and he was growing fabulously rich from trade. And then the successors that were named, while he was growing up in Chinggis Khan's camp, before they went to make war in Central Asia, Chinggis Khan named his successor. The brothers argued, he named his successor. It was his third son, Ogodei, and he did it because Ogodei had a diplomatic temperament, and he wanted the houses to get along. Batu saw and heard the discussions, which said that Chinggis Khan did not believe in inherited titles, inherited rulership, because, as he said, he had conquered too many people that had had bad rulers, because he said, if someone of my line does not prove suitable for rule, someone else will take the place. They will elect someone else. So I believe that this was in the back of Batu's mind when Ogodei, who was the successor, he was a liberal prince, he was a wise prince, but he was not, the business of state bored him. He would rather be hunting and visiting his concubines in his harem. And then his son Guyuk was, I'm not pronouncing these names correctly. If any of you have any, corrections, please send them to me. But Guyuk was intending to make war in the West. He wanted to be the ruler of Christendom. He wanted to make war on the Muslims, and Batu knew that this was a violation of the code, religious toleration. And Batu did not want a war. He wanted to keep getting rich and collecting. So he tried to prevent the election. Guyuk was not named the successor by his father. He basically rigged the election and stole the throne. When Batu visited Karakoram, he was an ally of the Princess Sorkhugtani, who's the title character of another book in this series that I've written. And she was the most remarkable woman of her age. And he decided that her sons, because they had a reputation for upholding the law, and he had her eldest son, Monka, in the army with him. He knew him, and he was a war hero. He wanted to put him on the throne. And eventually, and this is the story that I tell in the book, so I'm not going to spoil it and tell it for you now. These two collaborated, they waited their time, and they put Monka on the throne, and he was the most able leader after Chinggis Khan. It was a very wise move. But the most significant thing that he did was he turned the strategy of conquest. They had bankrupted the treasury, the two before him. And there was all kinds of, conflicts and stuff like that. So he had to put the Mongol Empire back on the road of conquest and fill up the treasury again. So he decided they were going to complete the conquest of China. They were going to conquer southern China. So the war in the West was called off. They were not going to attack. They had already delivered orders of submission to the Pope in Rome and to the caliphate, you know, and Manka just said, China is rich, this is the area, and he changed the whole strategy of the empire. And then after him came his younger brother, Kublai Khan. She was also the mother of this emperor, and he founded a dynasty in China which lasted for 100 years. So this huge shift in the focus and the strategy of the empire was all due and owing to Batu Khan. And he was the leader of the troops when they were in Russia. They were poised, they waged war in Hungary and Poland and parts of the Balkan Peninsula. And as I said, they were victorious. They had been, the Christian kings were sending warnings to each other, trying to unify, to fight them off. And they could not unify because the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor were at war. The Holy Roman Emperor kicked the Pope out of Rome. The Pope went to live in Lyon. He called a council. They excommunicated Frederick, and Frederick just told all of his, the princes in his empire who had castles, he said, fortify your castles. There's not going to be an offense against them, and we're not going to meet them in the field. You're each going to defend your own castles. So I leave it to you to decide what the empire would be. It's pretty much, historians pretty much agree that it was the lone superpower of the Middle East, of the Mongol Empire. It was the lone superpower of the time. So aside from the fact that the strategy changed and saved Europe, this Batu Khan basically saved Europe. It was the beginning of ocean-going trade, of the dominance of the ocean in the age of exploration. And all the old Silk Road fell into disuse over time. It was a long period of time because it was a whole system. But the European, when Marco Polo's uncle and father first went to the court, the Mongol court, they had liquidated all of their ordinary goods that they were selling in Constantinople and on the Black Sea. They had turned all of their goods into gems, which they were, but their object was to penetrate. They were the first traders to do this. They wanted to penetrate into the Mongol Empire to the sources of the gems and eliminate the middlemen so that they could gain the profits rather than paying them to basically Egyptians and Turkish dealers. They were stone dealers. But their whole idea was to, this is how they found themselves at the court of Kublai Khan. The idea was to begin to trade silks and teas and porcelains without the middlemen. It was the breaking of the old system of the monopoly of finance and trade. It was the entry of the Europeans into the Asian market. It was the opening of, and this, I give supplementary materials in the beginning of my, for students who are studying this, because there was a tremendous amount of cross-cultural influence on the old Silk Road. These cultures mingled. There was cross-influence in the arts, in music, in food, in ideas. This is how Buddhism first came into China. There was a tremendous, so when we compare the old Silk Road with the new Silk Road, this gives us some idea of what has gone before, so we know how we got to where we are now. And that is basically the story. So I wanted to open it up to questions to find out if you had any questions. And I wanted to thank the American Center for Mongolian Studies, because when I talk to editors in New York about these books, I am always considered, they say, well, you write exotic history. But when I come to the American Center for Mongolia Studies, I'm writing about the neighborhood. So I'm no longer an exotic. And I wanted to thank you for that. And thank you for listening. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Diane. Okay. I just typed in her Diane Wolff's website URL in the chat box once more if you guys want to.
Oh, can I say something?
Sure,
Can I say something?
sure.
For those of you who are going to the website, on the Batu Khan page for this book, in the left-hand menu margin, I've posted all the maps and illustrations, and I also posted the map that you saw of the Maritime Silk Road. I think that's very important. And I did a reading of the introduction, so there's like a little mini podcast too. But your supplementary materials, if you want to take a look to, if you take a look at the book and so you can locate yourself. And I think it's really important to take a look at the maps for this stuff because it's really hard. The reason that this is a scoop after 700 years is that the stories were always told in the languages of the enemies of Chinggis Khan and his successors, the people that he conquered, because at the time of the conquest, the Mongols had only had writing for 20 years, and Chinggis Khan gave them a written language based on the Uyghur language, by the way. He felt that the Uyghur education was the best for the Mongols, better than Chinese. But the story was always, this is why it took me 20 years to, up until after World War II, there wasn't enough, you could never master all these languages in a lifetime. So everyone stuck to their own. Persian scholars stuck to Persia, Russian scholars stuck to Russia, Chinese scholars stuck to China, Japanese, all that. And enough has come into English now so that one person, such as myself, I don't have all these languages, but I could get enough sources to tell the story. So the story of Batu Khan, I tried to piece together from the contemporary sources of the time, and then I based some of it on the secret history of the Mongols, which gives you the backstory. So at any rate, that's how I did it. But it's the reason it took so long is that every time you think you've done the reading, there, for example, you get to Europe, and then you have to find out about the Crusades, because all of this is taking place at the time of the Crusades, because the Europeans and the Saracens, which is what the Europeans called Muslims, were fighting each other for a century in the Crusades, and all of this is happening at the same time. So, one thing leads to another. At any rate, there are supplementary materials. And if you go on YouTube and just put in Alexander Nevsky, you can get that film, the Eisenstein film, and you can also get the Battle on the Ice, just the Battle on the Ice. So you get this idea of the recreation of medieval warfare and what it was. And then, of course, in the book, I tell you the equipment of the Mongol army, the training of the Mongol army, the strategy of the Mongol army. I didn't want to go into it here because I wanted to focus on trade rather than war. I wanted to give you a different aspect of this empire, which is often overlooked. So that's the backstory.
Yeah, thank you. I tried downloading the slideshows and also the podcast excerpts of your book, and I definitely recommend it for everyone to check it out. It's a really nice story. It really takes you back to the 13th century, and in this time of chaos, I think we can all escape to a good story. So thank you for that. We do have some questions coming in. The first one is by Matsadort. He asks, according to some people, the Battle of 1240 is considered as the origin of European Union. What do you think about this?
According to some people, is it in my chat line? Can I read this?
Oh, sure.
I'm trying to read
So it's visible. It should be visible for everyone.
Everyone. Okay. I'm trying to figure out 1240. Which battle are they talking about? I'm trying to figure.
A good question. Perhaps we can actually ask Ingvat to ask his question. Would you like to unmute and?
Am I muted? No, I'm not.
Sorry, I was addressing. Yeah, Ingvat, do you want to ask the question?
Yeah, I'm not understanding the question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, like there's a battle which is near like Hungary or current like Polish
Oh.
border, and so I think maybe it's the one like battle on the ice, or maybe I'm just mixing the. So which happened on the Hungary and the Poland border. So what do you think about that? So some people say it's
Oh,
like, okay, so if there was no Mongolian invade or some kind of like stuff, there wouldn't be EU or something like that. But I'm not sure for that. Just
well,
I
that's
just
what kind
heard
of what
about this. Yeah,
I'm
please
going to
go on.
refer you to the book. And the reason I'm going to refer you to the book is you're asking a really important question. The battle on the ice preceded the battle that you're talking about. Alexander was already a hero. But I took my description of the invasion of Europe. There's a very, very great military historian, a British military historian. And he has written the most beautifully about the invasion of Europe and what you're talking about, Poland and Hungary. And it's really too complicated to give in this particular talk because I was focusing on trade, but I've detailed it. It's great detail in the book. It's very important because what I tried to focus on, so I did not want to bore students. What I was trying to do with the students and also their parents, if the parents are reading the book, is reveal to them the thinking that went into this. In other words, the cliche is what we discovered, the scholarship, the post-World War II scholarship discovered this was an aristocratic horse culture. This was not undisciplined. So what I tried to put in the book was to give you the backstory. The Mongol army, the European sources always say they were demonic, there were so many of them, they overran us. Well, that's not true. The numbers of troops were always small. It was the discipline, the tremendous discipline. And Subedei and Batu, General Subedei, and forgive me if I'm not pronouncing these words right, they created a three-pronged invasion into Europe. And they fought the Battle of Hungary, which in my illustrations, I have a European illustration of the battle on the Danube. And the king actually left Hungary. So I've gone into a tremendous amount of detail. And as I said, I tried to base my telling of this story. I'm trying to tell the story in an engaging way for a young audience. And when I was a kid, my love of history came from my own father. And I'd say, Dad, how come when I go to class, all they talk about are dates and battles, and it's so boring. And he would tell me stories the way I'm telling you. So many thanks to my dad, who is no longer with us. But I tried to use, without writing a military history, I tried to engage you in the characters and then the relationship between Batu Khan and Subedei and the strategies that in other words, Batu Khan was a true heir to the legacy of Chinggis Khan, and he kept the general. So I refer you to the book, but yes, it's a very important question.
Thank you. Actually, we have some helpful comments specifying that it's Battle of Legnitsa. Legnitsa.
That is also in there. The Battle of,
Yeah.
I have in the, on my website, there's a PowerPoint presentation where I took illustrations from European sources, and there's an illustration by a contemporary European of the Battle of Liegnitz, and all of that is, I wanted to focus on trade in this talk.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I'm interested that you're asking questions about the battles because I was fascinated by them too. For example, when they first established a Khanate in Russia, meaning local administration with Mongol management and military garrison, it is said because they had at any time between 120,000 and 200,000 troops in this camp, divided into camping circles. And at the time of Batu Khan, they were conscripting replacement soldiers. Part of what the Russian princes had to give when they paid their tribute, they had to give a tithe, which was in goods or in money. They had to contribute troops to the army, and they had to contribute corvée labor, meaning conscripted labor for just such things as building a camp or whatever. But each soldier was required to bring 5 remounts. That was another secret of the Mongol army. So if you have 120,000 to 200,000 troops, you could have on the steppes a herd of 1 million horses, which will give you, I mean, think about that. That's pretty amazing. So,
Yeah.
And then I go into detail on the equipment of the Mongol army because it was so well equipped. It was the most well equipped army of the Middle Ages. And it's brilliant the way it's done. So, but I didn't want to repeat myself. So it's in the book. You're going to have to read the book. And then please email me and tell me what you think. You can email me through my website.
Yeah,
I hope that answers your question. Does it answer?
Mm-hmm. Okay. But I think Iqbal is happy with the question. I haven't heard from him. But here's another really interesting question that I do see in Ruth's raising of hand. She asks, will you tell us, first of all, many thanks for your interesting talk and happy to learn about your book. Will you tell us about the last period of Batu Khan?
Oh, well, that's again, it's such a great story. I tried to focus on enough to fit into a 30-minute talk, but I think the last period of his life is so fascinating because he became a kingmaker. So if you think about it, when he decided to put the son of Princess Sorkhugtani on the throne, the arrangement, Mongol Khan had fought in the campaign he had commanded troops under Batu Khan, so Batu Khan knew him from the battlefield. And Mongol Khan went to Russia to have what in essence was the job interview because Batu did not want to move back to Karakoram and run the empire himself. So he told, he told Mongol Khan that he had to purge all the relatives of Ogodei and Guyuk, or they would still fight him for the throne. And he said that he did not want the Muslim powers, meaning the assassins, the order of the assassins, which was the Shia heretics, basically, according to the Sunnis. And he did not want the caliphate on his southern border. And the reason for this was that he felt that the Muslims would plunge the whole world into war and it would be very, very unstable. So their attack on the assassins, which was also in my slideshow, there's a European print of and I have a very long description of, in one of the books in this Silk Road series is about Hulagu Khan, who is not generally known, and his attack on Alamut, which is in Iran, which was the fortress of the assassins. And they were conscripting, tell me if this sounds familiar, distressed youths from the bazaars, taking them to this place which was created like a paradise with gardens. They were smoking hashish, which is why they were called assassins. Hashishin was the name in Arabic. And they were committing political murders for hire all over the Muslim world. And their object was to bring down the corrupt leadership of Islam. So the caliph on many occasions originally wrote to Chinggis Khan, sent a messenger to Chinggis Khan and said, could you please come and help rid us of these assassins? And Chinggis Khan declined to interfere in a dispute between two factions of the faith. He would not get into it. That was not the last time they've sent, please come, please help us. So when Mongol Khan took the throne, he gave secret orders to his brother Hulagu, his younger brother. And he said, they sent 400 assassins against me on the day of my enthronement, which they did. 400 Hashishin came with daggers up their sleeves. And they said they were punishing the Mongols for the destruction that Chinggis Khan had wrought in Central Asia 30 years earlier. And they were all apprehended on the day of the coronation. And before they could be taken into custody and executed, they all slit their own throats with the daggers that they had up their sleeves. And then when Subedei and Batu had gone through the Transcaucasus into Russia, they had also taken some properties in Iran. And there was not a real Mongol administration there. It was very badly administered. So the Caliph of Baghdad took those properties. And Mongol was very annoyed because the Mongols were jealous of their revenues. So he had been sent orders to return that property, and he did not return it. So Mongol said, send him orders of submission. And the orders of submission were submit and be spared, resist and be plunged into humiliation. So the caliphate at Baghdad had been in existence, and I go into this in great detail in Hulagu Khan. You have to, all these stories link into each other, but for the sake of a student, I was trying to tell one personality and one story, and then when you read the whole group of them, you get the whole thing. But the caliphate had been in existence for 500 years. It was a center of learning. It was a center of culture. It was a center of faith. It was a center of commerce. It was everything. But for the previous century, it had been on the decline. It was a high point of Muslim civilization. The libraries were justly renowned. So when this upstart Mongol Khan sends this, and the caliph himself, as the records show, this is not it's not my judgment, it's the judgment of a contemporary Persian scholar, Juvaini. It was already corrupt. So when he got the notice of, the Mongol army is coming, so you better give us back that territory, he laughed. The caliph laughed. He said, you've been in existence for 50 years? I've been here for 500, our people have been ruling for 500 years. You are nothing. Go away. We are not submitting to you. And so after he finished with the assassins, Hulagu wrote on Baghdad, and I also have an illustration. There's a print in my the PowerPoint that you can link into on my website. There's an illustration of throne. Batu was the kingmaker. So now comes the House of Ogodei tried to prevent this switch from the House of Ogodei to the House of Tului. In my opinion, and the reason that I wrote this book, it was one of the principal events of the 13th century. And because Europe knew nothing about the rise of the Mongol Empire in Asia, they knew nothing about this. It's lost to the West. I mean, it affected everything. So, and this was Batu's doing that. So he goes to that particular enthronement because he has made this Kagan, and he brings an army of 100,000 people to ensure the peace of the coronation and the transfer of power. And then Monka had to purge all the members who would come against him. They one by one had to be dealt with. But that switch in the ruling houses that was affected with the alliance with the Princess Sorkhugtani, who was the most remarkable woman of her age, according to the European chroniclers, Gianna Plano Carpini. And I go into that in my book about Princess Sorkhugtani, who herself is an amazing character. So I give Batu credit for recognizing her power within the Mongol imperial family, her status within the Mongol imperial family, her skill as a diplomat. Her husband, when Genghis Khan died, her husband Tului Khan, who was Genghis Khan's youngest son, he was the Khan of Mongolia, and the Khan of Mongolia inherited the father's army and his lands, but he became the regent for 2 years before they put Ogodei Khan, they ratified Genghis Khan's successor. And she was the empress. She was literally ruling as the empress. And this particular time, it was a time of peace. It was a time of prosperity. They did a fabulous job. So Batu had a chance to see what this house was like when they took over compared to what the other guys were like with the spending and it was basically a hedonistic lifestyle, which, you know, was not good for the empire. And Batu and Sorkhugtani changed the ruling house. So that was the accomplishment. And then he went back to Russia and he died in 1255, not in battle and not of, it seems from the sources as though he died of natural causes and his son took over after he died. But so he died at the age of 50. And that was his career. I think it's quite fascinating. I hope you do too. I was hooked on it. I mean, I started doing this and it was just went on. It got bigger and bigger and bigger. And I couldn't stop. So that was my story.
Great. So we actually have a relevant question jumping off of when you mentioned Batu and Sorkhugtani, because Enril has asked 2 questions. And if you want to ask it yourself, Enril, I'll go ahead and unmute you. You're still muted.
Hello. Thank you very much for very comprehensive presentation. So I have 2 questions. Is Batu, is it the biography, your new book, or is it just one of the protagonists in your book? That's my first question. And secondly, also, like, you mentioned about the Maritime Silk Road that was enhanced by the Mongol Empire in the Middle Ages. That's very important topic for the Mongol history and also over like the ancient and medieval history for the global perspectives. But to me, I think the Batu and his immediate three successors solely focused on the overland Silk Road. For instance, like Sartaq, even he was quite interested in this crescent trade, right, with Middle East, Egypt, and also they have some claim over the Western Asia, including Iran itself. And I think it was the really Mukhtumut, the grandson of Batu, really made the privilege to the Genoese and Venetian traders when he gave Crimea as a penance to one of his cousins. So what do you think, and how Batu contributed to maritime trade if he was really involved in the European affairs? And what do you think of it? Thank you.
So the first question is, I was really trying to tell the story of Batu Khan in this book. So it's basically, I did not go into those who succeeded Batu as Khan of the Golden Horde. In the Hulagu book, I talk about Burqa Khan, who was his brother, not the son, it was the brother. And you are correct. In southern Russia, Batu was mainly concerned with the overland trade because he was taxing and getting tolls from the camel caravans. But some of the goods came to the overland through the Maritime Silk Road. As I said, both were used, and it was a coastal trade. So I don't go into his successors when that, but in Batu's main camp at Sarai, which was on the lower Volga River, the reason he built his camp there was because there was a river trade in timber with the northern principalities, the Russian principalities of Vladimir, Yaroslav, Suzdal, and Moscow. And they were not yet important. The Russian principalities were less important than Kiev. But he maintained that the taxes from the river trade. That was very important. So I appreciate the fact, what I was trying to really mention was to make a student aware that the overland trade was the most important. The maritime trade became more and more important as this age went on, but Batu Khan was really at the beginning of it all. I hope that answers your question. Does that answer your question?
Okay, great.
Does that answer
So,
your question? I don't know if I
I
answered
think
your
I see a
question. Oh,
nod
good.
there and a
Oh, he's
thumbs
giving
up.
me a thumbs up. Okay,
Okay.
so, but anyway, the book is the bio. I felt it was important to talk about the idea that this was not one, that the greatest failure of Chinggis Khan was to provide for an orderly succession to the throne. Batu Khan knew this because he was in the camp when Chinggis Khan made his last will and testament, and he made Ogodei his successor. It is my personal belief, having studied this, that when Batu Khan decided to change the ruling house to the House of Tului, he knew that his grandfather did not intend for inherited rulership because he didn't believe in it. And I believe that that is what motivated him, and that's what justified it in his own mind. He felt he was upholding not only the legacy of Chinggis Khan, but actually the code of laws. That's what I think. This is my reading of the history. Maybe you'll agree with me.
Okay, so actually we have just about enough time to take two more questions, and I think we should wrap it up. The first of which is the relationship between the Golden Horde and the other two Western hordes, the Ilkhanate and the Chagatai Khanate.
And the
What do you think? The Chagatai Khanate and the Ilkhanate?
Oh, the Chagatai. Oh,
Mhm.
I'm saying these the way I'm using an English pronunciation. It's probably not
that's fine.
proper. Okay.
Mhm.
Later on, you have to remember, Batu was the person who established all of this. After his time, and then, so Hulagu Khan answers, he's ordered by Monka to go in and take down the assassins and the caliphate, which he does. And he establishes an Ilkhanate in Persia. It's a standard Mongol Khanate with the local tax collection and conscription, and then the garrison, the Mongol garrison, and military rule, basically. It's a military government with local civilian rule. And that is the system that Chancellor Yelu invented. And one of my books is about Chancellor Yelu and the invention of this system of government on the old Silk Road. They did not try to rule these cultures. They let them have their own culture, their own religion, as long as they got their tribute and their taxes and their conscripted labor and military service. That was the old Silk Road. Burqa Khan, who was Batu's brother, was the first of the Mongol Khans to convert to Islam. And when he converted to Islam, he was furious with Hulagu for killing the caliph. And those two went to war. So that was the relationship between them. And I kind of tell that story in the Hulagu Khan. You can see the stories all branch off of the main story. So every time I started to write this in one book, I'd be going down all these different channels. And I thought, this book is going to be 1,000 pages and nobody's going to read it. Fortunately, I have a brilliant literary agent, and he said, why don't you write 5 books? So I took this big book and I focused each book on one character so that you get immersed in the life of this, the feelings, the life, the motivations. It's not a novel, but it's like narrative history. And then the other question was the relationship with the Chagatai Khanate. Well, again, after the time when Marco Polo's relatives and Marco Polo, they got to the encampment of Batu Khan, and they had all their fortune of their emporia converted into gems. And they were given an escort to go into the Chagatai Khanate, and they got as far as Bukhara, which was a huge center of trade. There were two centers of trade in that Khanate. One was Samarkand and one was Bukhara. Both of these cities were cities of Islamic culture. They were university towns with great centers of learning. They had very important mosques. They had very important local leaders, but they were a stopping point on the Silk Road, and they had caravanserais, which were where the merchants could stay. There was a place for them to sleep and eat, but they could take their animals, their camels that were laden down with the goods, very valuable goods, porcelains and silks and jade and tea and all this stuff. There was a place where they could house their animals so they could watch over basically their stock in trade, what they were going to use So there was a civil war between Arig Boka, Kublai Khan's younger brother, who was fighting him because he thought that Kublai Khan was getting too Chinese. And the younger brother was more of a Mongol traditionalist. And so he wanted to take his brother off the throne and get rid of all the Chinese style rule that Kublai had founded a Chinese dynasty. So there was yet another civil war. So the Burqa was fighting Hulagu, and Arigbok was fighting one of the principal administrators of the Chagatai Khanate, whose name was Burak. So Marco Polo and his father and his brother could not leave Bukhara for 3 years. That is where Marco learned the languages of the Mongol court. That's why he was so valuable to Kublai, because Kublai, he was a European. He had no interest in the factions at court, and the Khan could speak to him in his own language. That's how Marco Polo was so successful. But they were there for 3 years, and then an emissary from the court of Hulagu came through with the golden seal of authority that allowed, I am on the Khan's imperial business, I have free passage, I can go to all the Pony Express stops, I can get free mounts, I can get food, I can rest overnight. So Hulagu Khan took the Polos and said, I will give you an escort to the court of Kublai Khan. So that's how those two civil wars, which are a bit later than the period that I'm talking about, not much later, but maybe 15 to 20 years later. So they're not exact. But what happened was, what the sources seem to say is, the empire was so, you saw the map of the Khanates, which is also posted on my website. The distances were so vast, and the only communication, and they had a very good system of the post roads, which I go into in the book. But there were tensions, and they were starting to break up. And during Kublai Khan's time, his great problem was that he was going to have to let the Chagatai Khanate go. But that's a story that comes later. And the reason he was going to have to let it go is that they rebelled. Kaidu rebelled. And Arigboka rebelled, and he tried to separate Mongolia. And the advice at court from the General Bayan, the great general, and from the Chinese chancellor was, you can't let the Mongol homeland go because that's the site of our rule. That's the legitimacy of our rule. So you're going to have to let Central Asia go. And Kublai was devastated. This was the beginning of Kublai Khan's decline, which I go into. There's a book in this series called Typhoon, Kublai Khan Invades Japan by Sea. Once again, on this theme of this is the time when the warfare went to sea and the trade went to sea. It's the age when the age of exploration and the importance of the oceans comes in. So during this whole period, it's a gradual transition. To answer the person who asked me the question before, it's a gradual transition, but that is the beginning of the modern period, and that's what signifies the modern period, and that's why I told this story. So the idea of the Mongol Empire creating a fleet of war junks to invade Japan by sea is kind of a first in the annals of Mongol warfare, and that's why I put it in there.
Thank you. So you mentioned that your Silk Road series would have Sorkhugtani, Queen Sorkhugtan.
Would have what?
The Queen Sorkhugtani as one of your subjects of your book, right?
Yes, that's the next book.
Right.
Is the
So
Princess Sorkhugtani is
Mhm.
about her, only because women had very high status in the Mongol Empire, and it's not generally known and it's not generally understood. And they had higher status than, say, women in Europe and women in China. They owned property, they rode horses, they traded on their own behalf, and when their men were away, they managed the affairs of, for example, when Chinggis Khan was away making war, his principal wife, who was the empress, managed everything, and she kept him informed by the post roads. And then when he would come back, she would say, well, we sold so many of the herds, I made so much tanned hides. You know, she supervised the manufacture of the products of a pastoral society, meaning the felt that was beaten from the sheep wool to make the tents, the gear tents, and she supervised the tanning of hides and the breeding of horses and the making of kumis, the fermented mare's milk. So, and when the Khans were away, Princess Sorkhugtani had learned all the management of affairs and estates from her mother-in-law, who was the empress. They heard the court cases, they heard the disputes between different members of the different tribes. So, you know, this was, it did not exist elsewhere. There would be from time to time an example of a woman ruler, but Elizabeth I, don't forget, is much later than this, of England, Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. This is much later. So for the time, it was not, because of the Mongol, the idea of the sky god as the father god and the earth mother, the idea of the balance of male and female was very important. And it was not considered a mark of weakness to take the advice of a woman who was now, Sorkhugtani, I tell her story because it's so fabulous. She was the niece of the most powerful man in the steppes before Genghis Khan. This was her uncle, the Om Khan. And he betrayed Genghis Khan and was therefore defeated. But she grew up listening to all the intrigues and the rivalries, and she was no stranger to the how shall we say, the skullduggery in the tents of the Khans. She knew it. So when it came time to preserve, she watched her father-in-law. She was Genghis Khan's favorite daughter-in-law. And she watched him build the empire. She was married to, he personally arranged her marriage. And she watched him build the empire and establish the Khanates that you saw in the map. And then she was watching these weak men who were his successors nominated, they were destroying it. I can't hear the question.
Okay, if anyone, did anyone else want to ask a question? I see some unmuting. If they were accidental, I'm going to ask the final question. Basically, Oyun Bilik asks if you could recommend a book about Subedei and his
oh
the
God,
biography.
there is.
I actually wanted to sort of broaden it and ask you to recommend sort of the you know, the main books on the era of the 13th century, or the Khans after Chinggis. What are some you know, basic reading list books that you would recommend, not only on Subedei but also on other biographies of other figures in the Mongol Empire?
Well, I have a really authoritative list. Could I post it somewhere? Because offhand, I'm blocking the name of there's a biography of Subedei that's fabulous. As to the other Khans, the best book that I know of is Maris Rasabi's Kublai Khan, His Life and Times. And that's for the Yuan. The reason that I write these books is that there's very little out there, but I'm going to go over, maybe I will send a list to you and you could post it for them, because offhand, I forget the author. There's a terrific bio of, and one of the things is in doing the research that I've done, I've separated out what I consider to be the best sources. But I don't mean to sound foolish, but part of the difficulty was in piecing together these narratives about these different people from all these different sources. So sometimes it's hard to find an individual source on some of the, but I will do my best and I will recommend. It may be, though, that, like for Burqa Khan, I don't think there's a bio of him. It may be that they are, and I was trying to get ones that were balanced so that it wouldn't just be from one side. I was trying to get, you know, but all of the great post-World War II scholarship is much more balanced. So, but up until now, we have a couple of great bios of Chinggis Khan, but not the later Khans. So I will do my best. I will put Subedei up there, and the that work of military history, the British military historian that I was telling you about, is his last name is Hart, H-A-R-T, and it's called Great Captains Unveiled is the title. And there's one chapter in there on Subedei, which is the authoritative chapter on the invasion of Europe.
Great, that's actually a great idea. We can definitely post it on our social channels when you email the list to us. That could maybe also become like a closing note, as well as a reminder for everyone after the recording is published. Okay, so thank you,
and
everyone.
Anybody, you can reach me, you can email me through my website or through my Twitter site. I'm, you know, and I'll try to answer your questions if you have them. But thank you very much. This has been very, as I said, it's a great feeling to be, not to be considered exotic history.
Yeah, thank you. It's always great to hear that, you know, a U.S. writer writing about Mongolian history is a great way for our two cultures and countries to, you know, it's your work is basically a bridge between our two cultures. So we really thank your contribution, and we look forward to reading the books. It looks like these are going to be really, you know, new, fresh angles of rather overshadowed figures. So really excited about those.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Diane, for your presentation. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. So we'll have this video uploaded on the YouTube channel, and if you want to, you know, follow us, subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you have any feedback on our formats, we're always open to listen to you on our social media channels, as well as the info@mongoliacenter.org website email address. Just wanted to just wanted to quickly plug that we do have another event, that a panel actually, Roy Chip and Andrews, as mentioned before, next Friday. But it was great to have you, Diane. So thank you again, and have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.